Cyberpunk 2077. It was a game that was announced way back in 2012, and the first teaser for this actually dropped in January of 2013. After that, CDPR dropped what was one of the best games of that generation in Witcher 3, and all this while we have been waiting for Cyberpunk 2077. And we were waiting for CDPR's next masterpiece. The hype was already through the roof, but then CDPR went and added another step to that by bringing in Keanu Reeves on the stage. It seemed as if there was absolutely nothing that could stop this game from being an instant success. Yet after multiple delays, this game finally rolled out on December 10th, 2020. Now I don't need to tell you what followed was an unmitigated disaster. It became very clear that the game barely worked through its plethora of bugs and glitches on a PC, let alone the poor and humble last-gen consoles that it was aiming for. CDPR had shot their shot and missed the mark. By a lot. People were starting to get refunds, CDPR then got hit by hackers, which is kind of ironic considering, Cyberpunk. And in the end, the biggest blow really came when Sony removed the game from its storefront. While the launch was obviously on CDPR, the biggest reason why this game appears to have failed is hype. This game was announced so far ahead of its release that people had made their own version of the game in their minds. The hype was so much that the game could never have realistically lived up to it, even if, say, it had launched in a stable condition, which it obviously did not. We have seen this before as well. Games that promise way too much and deliver way too little. And to illustrate this point, I am making this video now, 9 months after the launch of Cyberpunk 2077. The game is stable enough now. Stable enough that I was finally able to complete it. Although I cannot say that I didn't run into issues even with the latest patch that is 1.31. Like for example, for me this happened, Takemura just forgets to call me after a day and I was sitting there waiting trying to fix the shit and eventually it started working again. But nevertheless, I was able to complete the main game and also some of the side content. The gameplay is average. The gunplay is sluggish. The RPG systems look like they were actually built for a game from 2013. The crafting is basic and rudimentary. The driving somehow feels worse than the Watch Dogs games, which off the top of my mind, that's the worst I can think of. The AI hovers between bad and non-existent. The cops don't work. And no, I'm not talking about the bugs. I'm talking about the design. The game is designed in this way. The game is designed so that the loot is underwhelming. The game is designed in a way that cops are essentially useless. The game is designed with a range of DPS numbers that scale on how high the level of a weapon is. Which in my opinion is a terrible choice for an FPS game. Actually, I said that even before the game would have come out, that I don't think this is going to work properly. And I stand by my point. This is terrible. And Cyberpunk is an FPS at the end of the day, even if it is in a guise of an RPG. Like I've said this about Fallout as well, that if you want to have proper first-person shooting mechanics, then make sure your shooting actually works. This was also an issue for me in Fallout games, especially in Fallout 4, and technically it was fixed by modders a little bit, but even then it's not really good, and Cyberpunk is even worse in that aspect. And it's not like we haven't seen an proper FPS that is also an open world game. Because Far Cry has been doing this for well over a decade now. So I don't understand why they didn't take more inspiration from those games for more action-oriented games rather than the more RPG games. I feel like the gameplay would have been much better if they had even had the more responsive gunplay that something like Far Cry 5 had or Far Cry New Dawn had. Because if you guys remember, Far Cry New Dawn actually has that RPG, like RPG light or slight RPG system. So yeah, that would have worked. At least the gunplay would have been satisfying, which in Cyberpunk is just not. So is that it then? Is Cyberpunk 2077 an unforgivable mess that was put out by CDPR? No, not by a long shot. As I said, it was the hype that ultimately killed the game. People expected excellent gameplay, they shouldn't have. What they should have expected is what CDPR has always done: storytelling and world building. That is their strength. Now, admittedly, sometimes the world does look like it hasn't quite finished building because of the glitches. But one cannot deny that Night City is one impressive looking city, and it has stories to tell all over it. Now, I know that open world games always fall into this trap of being repetitive in terms of gameplay. That's something I've said in many videos already, and Cyberpunk really doesn't do much to avoid that. It is basically the same thing over and over again. But the stories themselves redeem these shortcomings. The various gigs that we have in the world, they are their own mini stories, sometimes even their own mini story arcs. And while the NPCs calling you every few minutes does get a bit annoying, I cannot lie about that, it has been dialed back since what it used to be at launch, and now it just feels like a more immersive experience. Like when I say now, I mean after the patches, after they dialed that down. Which now I realize is kind of a pun because, the NPCs are dialing you. Well, anyway. And now from that, we move on to the main attraction, the main story itself. And I'm not going to give too much of it away because I still feel like this is a game that everyone should experience. This game does have a great story to tell, and the story is presented in a great way. While I initially thought that not having cutscenes were weird, especially because you were customizing your character but you could never really see it, it works here. That's all I can really say. It makes it feel more true to the way the story is being told. This is V's story, no matter which gender you're picking. And the story never really gets to extremely high stakes. The highest it ever gets is during the prologue. And in the end, I'm not going to spoil, but pretty much the entire thing in the game, the thing that you were running away from in the game, gets solved rather easily, to be fair. And the consequences are very minimal because one character actually returns, and I'm not going to name which one. But the story is about V. Well, mostly anyway. And some might take that to mean that this game doesn't have much else to say rather than that. But it really does. You need to be patient with the story to truly appreciate it. Yes, I did expect a little bit of technology to play more of an aspect, to see more of an impact that technology was having. More of a Black Mirror kind of a thing, if you will. But slowly I started to understand that the reason why these things were not discussed in detail is because A, that is something we need to pick up from the story itself, and B, for the people who are living in that world, for we, for other people who are there, it's natural. They are in a world, they were born into a world where all of that is just the norm. So while it might not look normal to us, for the sake of the story, it is normal. And that is something that you yourself need to piece together. That is something that you yourself need to understand. But I would understand if you don't. Not everyone will have the same mindset as me, and frankly, expecting the contrary is foolish. It's like saying that every game ever should appeal to me. That's not the case. And that should also not be the case for anyone else. That brings me back to the point in hand. The launch of Cyberpunk and the subsequent shitstorm that engulfed this game made it so that people didn't really have the opportunity to appreciate this game for what it was, because it was saddled with the expectations of what it could have been. And that is what hype does. And I've said before that this is not the first time we have seen this, and I'm going to give another example of a game that I personally enjoyed but was overhyped to the point where everyone hated it. And that example is Watch Dogs. Now, it was hyped to all hell. It was going to be the GTA killer. The graphics shown in that first trailer is something that franchise has failed to reach even in their latest titles, even in 2020. And they showed that game off in 2012. And now most people remember it as being a mediocre or even a bad game. But that is far from the truth. And I don't blame people for that, because people couldn't see past their expectations to judge the game for what it actually was, what the game was trying to be. Something very similar happened to Cyberpunk, but at a much bigger scale. But if you look at Cyberpunk 2077 for the game that it actually is, it is a game with a great story. It's a game with great characters. It's a game with a great setting, with great environments, but with a serviceable gameplay, with serviceable background mechanics, with serviceable base structuring. Almost exactly like Witcher 3. I have not said this about Witcher 3, at least not in a video before, but I really do not think Witcher 3's gameplay is anything special, or the underlying RPG systems were anything special. What made that game special was its story, was its characters, was its setting. That's what latched people onto that game. And I don't feel like not having gameplay as your sole focus is honestly that bad of a thing. Like, the gameplay is serviceable enough, especially now that things are sort of fixed. I'm putting fixed in double quotes here. Obviously you can't see the double quotes, but I am. Since it's now fixed, it works to some extent and it's fine enough for me. Which brings me to my conclusion. Hype is not bad when it is used in the right way. But that is not something that CDPR did. By not managing the expectations, they shot themselves in the foot before the game was even out. And by launching the game in the state they did, they might as well have replaced the bullets with nukes instead. But none of these things detract from the fact that Cyberpunk 2077 is a great game when it plays to its strengths. It might not be a game for you. It might not be a game for someone else. But it is a great game regardless. Alright guys, that brings about the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed it, then consider pressing that like button, and also do subscribe to my channel for more content, because there is more content coming. I know I didn't really put Cyberpunk much on my channel because A, I didn't really play much, and B, even when I started playing it, I basically just finished the game in like 2 days. And I didn't feel like streaming it as well. But I might consider actually replaying the game on my channel at some point, so it will probably come. But other than that, there are quite a few games coming up, so subscribe to my channel for all that content, and I will leave you guys in peace.